So over these next two videos, we're going to be talking a little bit more about LBJ and essentially what his foreign policy was revolving around during his presidency, which was the Vietnam War. So to give you a bit of background, our involvement in Vietnam begins when American policy dictates that our troops support France in their fight against a communist revolution that was happening in Vietnam. So France originally controlled Vietnam. North Vietnam and South Vietnam. You see North is yellow and South is red down here. So Vietnam is almost shaped like an S. It sort of curls right here around this peninsula. And the Communist Revolution that was occurring in North Vietnam and was being led by this guy right here, Ho Chi Minh. So the French needed our help, and we volunteered because we still needed their support to help keep up the communist containment effort in Europe. So we stick this guy right here, Ngo Dinh Diem, in South Vietnam, and he had lived in exile in the United States for a little while before this, and so we had gotten to know him and had a good relationship with him then. So he was elected to be the prime minister of South Vietnam. So we had a good relationship with South Vietnam. We wanted to help out France. We wanted to contain communism. But the biggest thing is the domino effect, which I've got written right here at the bottom. So the domino effect is this new idea floating around that if one country falls to communism, the rest will as well. And so we're trying to contain communism. Remember, that's why we fought the Korean War. That's why we've been doing all the things we've been doing in the Middle East and in Europe at this point. So that's the whole reason we get in here. So nevertheless, we are going to enter the war on behalf of South Vietnam, essentially, here at this point. So early on, we placed those troops in South Vietnam to essentially be military I guess you would say advisors to the South Vietnamese military and army. They were supposed to train them and equip them to fight North Vietnam. But quickly people come to realize that our boys are actually going to be seeing a lot of combat, and it's not necessarily solely this advisor type of role. Early on in all of this, JFK had signed an executive order to finally pull our troops out after only being there for a few months. But he died before that could go into effect. And 2 days after he was buried, LBJ signed a new order undoing that, and we're going to see an increase in escalation in how all of this is going to play out. So LBJ is the reason why we got involved in Vietnam, and he's the reason that it got as escalated as crazy as it did, and he is also the reason why it didn't work out for us. And all of this really starts for him in August of 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin. So on August 4th of 1964, August 4th is Obama's birthday, by the way, day after my birthday. But August 4th of 1964, 2 U.S. destroyers located right here in the Gulf of Tonkin were attacked. So in response, Johnson got in front of Congress and he requested that they approve his proposal to retaliate with airstrikes. Now, what he left out was that United States ships were only there to participate in combat raids against the North Vietnamese, and that the commander of one of the American ships wasn't exactly entirely sure of what had even gone down. He totally left that part out, twisted the situation around, used it to his advantage to escalate what had been a relatively calm situation. What Congress does, though, is make things worse by passing something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. What this says, they issued this on August 7th. What this says is that it gives Johnson the ability to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. So this is essentially a blank check. They're giving LBJ a blank check. They're allowing him to send as many people to Vietnam as he wants, to use as many weapons as he wants, to bomb as much as he wants, to spend as much money as he wants. And this is going to be a huge issue going into the future. He's really running the show. So we don't get a declaration of war in the Vietnam War, just like Korea. But this was not a police action. This was, it's classified as a whole other issue. But I don't want you to be looking for a treaty at the end of this, because we are not going to technically declare war on Vietnam here. So LBJ is going to increase the manpower that we have in Vietnam with a two-phase bombing strategy. He's going to elevate the amount of troops we have from 75,000 to 125,000. But things are still continuing to grow worse for us. We're losing civilian governments to communist governments in the South. So he keeps spending money, keeps sending more troops. At the peak of all of this, the military spending was $2 billion per month. Higher taxes had to be imposed, inflation skyrocketed, and Americans aren't seeing the cause as worth the manpower or the money, and they're really starting to blame Johnson. So Vietnam, I would definitely say, is going to shape LBJ's legacy a lot more than I'm sure he would have liked it to. So the Vietnam War enters a new phase in 1968 when something begins called the Tet Offensive. Now, Tet is the Vietnamese New Year's. It's on January 31st. And it's a huge festival. I mean, like, imagine the 4th of July and New Year's like rolled into one holiday. That's essentially what Tet is. On the night of Tet, on the night of January 31st, at about 2 a.m., the North Vietnamese had apparently smuggled in people, weapons, bombs, you name it, and launched simultaneous attacks on every single capital of every single province in South Vietnam and every single U.S. military base. It was about 15 simultaneous attacks that we were totally caught by surprise and not prepared for. The United States began receiving dramatic losses, and LBJ was forced to increase troops to 700,000 to maintain our hold in the South. So we essentially at this point have over a million, or almost a million troops in Vietnam under the command of this man right here, General William Westmoreland. He's our commander of American troops in Vietnam. Now, the fighting in Vietnam is different than we've ever seen before. It's an entirely different climate. We are seeing, high temperatures, tropical weather, high humidity. We're essentially fighting in a jungle. Not to mention we have to deal with Viet Cong. So Viet Congs are sometimes abbreviated as VCs. VCs are South Vietnamese people who are secretly working for North Vietnam, and there are tons of them. So there's all these spies. Anyone could be a traitor. You never know. So it's just a high stress, high paranoia, and very violent situation that we've got our boys living in. So we're seeing higher rates of PTSD than we've ever seen before among our soldiers, and that's going to play out in some really awful ways. The most famous of which is the My Lai massacre. So in March of 1968, American troops led by Lieutenant William Calley Jr. were led to the small village of My Lai in South Vietnam. We were told that we were going to be finding about 250 Viet Cong, but instead they found women, children, and elderly people. But instead of turning around or realizing that maybe the intel was wrong, Lieutenant William Calley Jr., who clearly had a strong case of post-traumatic stress disorder, ordered the execution of the entire village anyway. The emotional impact of these soldiers suffered was a great deal of emotional damage. It was clear that some of them had totally lost control. And William Calley Jr., had also, very clearly suffered greatly. And so to him, by this moment, it was like anyone and everyone is an enemy and is out to get him, and so even children. So that's sort of how this happened. And so word of this incident spread, and Calley ended up getting convicted of premeditated murder in 1971. So we're seeing the idea of soldiers change because of this. So Americans have not been supportive, necessarily like unanimously supportive of every war that we've ever been involved in. We've always seen people oppose wars. But we have never seen on such a large scale people not only oppose the war, but oppose soldiers who are being forced to participate in the war, even draftees. A lot of our soldiers were treated really horribly when they came home. They were considered to be crazy and violent. They called them baby killers. It was just really awful stuff that was happening to them when they really had no say in the matter. And so we're seeing a lot of problems, a lot of tumultuous times here when we get into the late 60s and early 70s, but especially that year, 1968. That's when the Tet Offensive happens. That's when My Lai happens. That's when MLK is assassinated. That's when Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. That's when the Detroit riots happen. So we just are continuously seeing the violence overseas and on television playing out on the streets of the United States as well. And violence is really the theme of that year, 1968.